In this video, we're going to go in and put all of the knowledge that we have about price floors, price ceilings, equilibrium, demand and supply shifters, and put all this together and go in and see what happens to these markets when the demand or the supply curve shifts in one direction or another. So what you want to do before you even go in and you read each one of these examples, the graph that you want to start out with will be one that looks like this. So you want your quantity on the horizontal, your price on the vertical axis. Go ahead and draw yourself a downward sloping demand curve, mark it with a D naught. Now remember, we don't know starting out whether it's going to be a demand or a supply shifter. So we're marking it D naught because it could be a demand shifter. And your upward sloping supply curve, mark it with an S naught, and that will give us a good starting point. Now, the vast majority of the times we don't actually have the numeric value for the equilibrium price, and most of the time it doesn't matter. All we want to know most of the time is what's going to happen to that price. Is it going to be going up or is it going to be going down? So start out with an equilibrium price, call it P naught, and an equilibrium quantity, which is going to be Q naught. So you're going to be seeing that this is a reoccurring theme that you want to draw this graph before you ever get started. Then you want to go in and you want to look for a couple of different things. Number one, is this what we call a price change only? Now the way you'll know that is the language will be such that the price is above equilibrium or the price is below equilibrium. Very much like the first one on your supply and demand worksheet. So if the price is above equilibrium, you'll end up with a surplus. If the price is below equilibrium, you're going to end up with a shortage. So be looking for that specific terminology. If that doesn't occur, then be looking for either price floors or price ceilings. And so you have the knowledge now of going in and drawing the price floor or the price ceiling, and then doing the analysis to see whether you have a surplus, a shortage, or neither. If none of those are mentioned, then you want to look for either a demand shifter, and if it isn't a demand shifter, then it has to be a supply shifter. And once you've determined which one it is, then we're going to go in and we'll shift the appropriate curve one direction or the other, and then we'll come up with our new equilibrium. All right, let's give this a shot. All right, before we ever go in and before we ever read the example, let's go in and draw our demand and supply analysis. So we have quantity and price. We have a downward sloping demand curve, mark it with a D naught. Upward sloping supply curve, mark it with an S naught. Again, in this particular case, we're going to be dealing with the price and quantity of houses. So we don't necessarily need to know exactly what that is. So we'll mark our equilibrium with Q naught, and we'll mark our equilibrium quantity with a Q naught. All right. So this is assume the economy is in a period of expansion and incomes are on the rise. What will happen to the price and quantity of houses in the United States? All right, let's go back up to the top. Is it a price change only? Notice nowhere in any of this terminology did we say anything about the price being above or below equilibrium. All right, so that's not going to be it. There are no price floors or price ceilings that are mentioned, so that's not going to be it either. So you want to go in, turn to your notes where you start your demand shifters, and you notice your first demand shifter is going to be population. Well, it doesn't say anything here about population. Your second demand shifter is going to be income. Well, notice it says that the economy is in a period of expansion and incomes are on the rise. So income is in fact a demand shifter. And again, if you look in your notes, if income increases, then you'll notice you have an increase in demand. So if you have an increase in demand, what happens is that the demand curve is going to shift out and to the right. All right, so we'll shift it out to D1. And so as demand increases, then we come to a new equilibrium, which is going to be right here. So once you find your new equilibrium, this is going to be your new equilibrium price, call it P1. This is going to be your new equilibrium quantity, call it Q1. Whoops, call it Q1. And there is the correct graph for this particular example. All right, so that is the very basic idea of how you go in and how you determine what is actually happening in these particular markets. All right, let's go in and take another one. Let's say again, this one we're talking about computers. So before we get started, let's go in and draw our analysis. So we have quantity and we have price. Do not forget to mark these on your graphs. I will take off points if your axes are not labeled. So here's your initial demand curve, call it D naught. Here's your initial supply curve, we'll call it S naught. All right, so we have our equilibrium price of computers, we'll simply call it P naught. And we have our equilibrium quantity, Q naught. All right, again, that's how we're always going to get started. According to this, assume that new production techniques have been developed which makes computers cheaper and easier to build. What will happen to price and quantity of computers? All right, again, if you go back up here, we didn't mention anything about the price being above or below equilibrium, and we didn't mention anything about price floors or price ceilings. And you'll find out if you go through your demand shifters, there's nothing about population, there's nothing about tastes and preferences, the price of complements, substitutes, or any of those other things. In fact, just by the way this reads, we're going in and talking about the production, the supply of computers. So when you're going in and talking about new production techniques, you're talking about changes in technology. And changes in production technology is actually your third shifter of the supply curve. And remember, when technology increases, there's always an increase in supply. So what you'll want to do then is go to your graph, and when you increase supply, you're going to shift your supply curve out and to the right. So let's go in and let's call it S1. So we started out with an equilibrium here. As the supply curve shifted out, we went down and we came to a new equilibrium right here. So that means that our equilibrium price decreased in this market and the equilibrium quantity increased, Q1. And so that would be the appropriate graph if you have an increase in production technology. All right, so hopefully you're starting to get the idea of how this is supposed to go. Let's go in and let's try the third one. So as the number of windmills in the Midwest increases, what will happen to the price and quantity of electricity? So we can go in and we can draw our demand and supply for electricity. So we have quantity and price. We have a downward sloping demand curve for electricity. And we have our upward sloping supply curve, S naught. All right, starting out with our equilibrium price of electricity, however much that is per kilowatt hour, and we have our equilibrium quantity. Now this is another one, when you go out and you start to look at it, the number of windmills are increasing in the Midwest, which means that we're able to generate more electricity than we were before. So keep in mind, just because we have more windmills doesn't mean the demand for electricity is changing, but that is changing how much electricity we are actually able to produce. So this could come under either production technology or it could come under the number of firms. Either way, you're going to have the same result. Both of these are going to give us an increase in the supply of electric power. So if that's the case, you go over to your graph and you shift your supply curve out and to the right, out to S1. Again, we started off with our equilibrium here. Now that the supply curve is shifted out, now we have a new equilibrium right here. So as these windmills pop up in Kansas and Oklahoma, the price of electricity should go down, and the quantity of electricity that is going to be produced should increase as well. Okay, so there's another one where you have an increase in the supply, and you notice the procedure is exactly the same. All right, let's go up and let's take a look at this one. A major hurricane moves into the Gulf of Mexico, and a number of gas refineries must be closed. So what will happen to the price and quantity of gasoline in the United States? All right, again, we're going to start out. Hopefully this gets old. The older it gets, the better you get at it. So we have a downward sloping demand curve for gasoline, D naught. Upward sloping supply of gasoline, S naught. All right, so we know our equilibrium price of gasoline, whatever that happens to be. And here is our equilibrium quantity. Now again, clearly when you read this doesn't have anything to do with how much gasoline we're going to consume, so it's not a demand shifter, but it does have to do with how much gasoline that we're actually going to be able to produce. And in this particular case, as this hurricane moves in, the number of gas refineries or the number of firms in this particular market is going to decrease. They're not going to be able to produce as much gasoline as they did before because now they're closed. And when the number of firms goes down, that supply curve decreases. And as supply decreases, that shifts that supply curve back and to the left. So there's your decrease in supply. So what you notice is when we do have hurricanes move into the Gulf region and these refineries do shut down, we end up with an increase in the price of gasoline, and we end up with a decrease in the quantity of gasoline as well. So again, this particular graph will get you full credit on a problem like this. All right, and then finally, the last one that we have looks something like this. Assume the AMA publishes a report that says if a person eats 10 McDonald's cheeseburgers per week, their sex drive will increase by 35%. All right, there you go. And now, you know, if this actually happens, people will be going home saying, hey, baby, I ate 50 cheeseburgers this week, right? The one thing you don't want to get in your mind is that this example over here is Frank and Robin Hill. Okay, sorry about that one. If you went in and you watched this video before lunch or dinner, you're probably not hungry anymore. But anyway, all right, so we're talking about the demand and supply for McDonald's cheeseburgers. So we have quantity and price. We have a downward sloping demand curve for McDonald's cheeseburgers and an upward sloping supply curve. All right, so whatever the price, the equilibrium price of a cheeseburger is, there's our equilibrium price, and here is our equilibrium quantity. Now, this is an interesting one, and these are the types of ones that you come up with quite often, because if you go in, and again, if you look up here, it has nothing to do with a price change. It doesn't say that the price of cheeseburgers is above or below equilibrium. It has nothing to do with price floors or price ceilings. Now, if you go in and you start looking at your demand shifters, what you'll find is it doesn't have anything to do with the number of firms. The same number of McDonald's restaurants are there. It doesn't have anything to do with income. It has nothing to do with the price of substitutes or complements. So this is one of those that actually falls under that taste and preference category. Remember I said in that video that if you know it has something to do with consumption, but it doesn't fall nice and neatly under any of those other categories, then it probably is a taste and preference. So if people read that, their sex drive is going to increase by 35% if they eat McDonald's cheeseburgers, then that means their demand for McDonald's cheeseburgers is going to increase. So as that demand curve shifts out into the right, eventually we will hit a new equilibrium where we will see the price of McDonald's cheeseburgers increase, and we will see the quantity of McDonald's cheeseburgers increase as well. All right, so there are just a couple of examples, talking your way through the example and figuring out exactly what curve needs to be shifted, in which direction it needs to shift, and then finding out finally what's going to happen to your equilibrium price and your equilibrium quantity.